welcome to another episode of EmpowerED's Consulting's Social Justice podcast series. This podcast was created on behalf of the Social Justice Committee to educate and raise awareness on different topics within social impact and education. We're your hosts for this episode. I'm Mira Patel, and I'm a junior at NYU.
And I'm Joy Wexler, and I'm also a junior at NYU. So we'd like to introduce our guest for this episode, Professor Pamela D'Andrea Martinez. She is a graduate researcher and adjunct professor at the NYU Metro Center. Given her extensive research on how current education methods and standards may favor certain cultures and lack accommodations for others, we thought she would be the perfect guest to interview for this episode's theme. Rather than overlook certain groups or cultures, how can schools embrace the diversity of cultural perspectives that their students bring?
Pamela, we'd appreciate if you could introduce yourself to our audience and talk a bit about how you became involved in educational equity.
Sure. I am an urban education PhD student in the teaching and learning department at NYU. And as you covered, I also do research at the NYU Metro Center, and I've been there for a few years. Right now my research is focused on, and this is for my dissertation research, it's focused on culturally sustaining education for immigrant youth. So it's sort of extending this kind of conversation, really honing in on the experiences of newcomers, particularly youth who have come to the US in the last 4 years or less. And so what does it mean to sustain cultures and that transnational lens that young people bring and the multilingualism that they bring? And so I got into the work really from that angle. I was a high school teacher and an elementary teacher. I taught Spanish at the high school level, and this was a public high school. And then I taught dual language at the elementary level. And so often working with immigrant youth and thinking about issues of language and culture. And one of the things that really struck me when I was a high school teacher, and you'll hear a lot of people that come in from like a language perspective bring this sort of analysis into the work, but here I was teaching Spanish, and at the same time, there were young people entering the school that were being asked to relinquish their Spanish. And so I was like, wait, so who has the right to speak Spanish? And what Spanish is being privileged here and what Spanish isn't being privileged here? And so it was that kind of thinking that led me to a more kind of social and equity lens. So the entryway was language, but then it became, oh, wait, language can't be talked about without race. It can't be talked about without immigration status. It can't be talked about without disability status. Like all of this has to have, sort of like an overlap. So that's how I entered it. And then, coming to NYU, beginning to do research with the Metro Center, focusing on urban education. And so that was the trajectory.
So we know you work a lot with the Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools, and that you wrote an extensive research paper on culturally responsive sustaining education. I know in the paper you touched on what a deficit perspective was in education. Could you please explain to our audience what that is and how that differs from a perspective characteristic of culturally responsive sustaining education?
I mean, deficit perspective is, I think the word captures it well, but I do want to say it's more than a perspective. We use the word perspective in that piece, and a lot of people use the word perspective, but the idea that we might look at some people as having identities that they have to overcome in order to succeed in school. Like for me to succeed in school, like kind of the example that I gave before, for me to succeed in school, I have to be white. For me to succeed in school, I have to be whatever those kind of underlying biases are that inform that perspective, means that when we look at young people, we look at them as lacking, particularly Black, Indigenous, people of color, and then folks that don't align with those identities that we privilege. And so we do this not just in our perspectives, we do this in the curriculum. We do this in the processes of schools, the structures of schools. So the word perspective sometimes isn't even hard enough to explain the deepness of that racism, that classism, that sexism that young people are experiencing, because a perspective is something like in the same conversation, I might flip your perspective on something and boom, it's done. And now you have a new perspective. And that's not really how this thing works. It's kind of like a machine of things that are working to disempower young people and tell them, hey, you don't belong in this space. So if I were to tell you what a deficit, perspective or deficit set of issues is, it's that it's the thing that young people, when they walk into the space, all the things that are telling them that they don't belong. And so, you know, that's going to come from a lot of different angles. And so that's a deficit perspective. But the culturally sustaining folks, the folks that are talking about culturally sustaining education, give us an important caution that I think we should heed. And one of them is that the opposite of deficit should not be asset. And what I mean by that is, if we're looking at young people and we're saying, you know, we can't always focus on the negative, we have to also focus on the positive. Then it becomes about young people telling us all the time, hey, here are the positive things about me that you should care about. And the problem with that is that if we're always asking young people to justify their identities and their cultures to us, then the white gaze is still on them. You know, this is what the culturally sustaining folks, particularly Django Paris, uses Toni Morrison's white gaze to talk about this, which is that, you know, we're still trying to ask young people to justify and to justify their humanity to us, but through a white lens. And so instead, what culturally sustaining education is asking us to do is to get rid of that lens altogether. Get rid of the patriarchal lens, get rid of the able-bodied lens, get rid of the white lens, and to instead say, like, what are young people's cultures, and how can we sustain and help those cultures grow in the school space and beyond the school space? And that school doesn't become about, hey, in order to succeed here, you have to say goodbye to these things. You have to be complicit in your own eradication. And that's what schools are asking right now us to do. So I don't know if that gives you like a good explanation.
That was great, thank you. Could you please elaborate on any long-term consequences of students growing up in schools fostered by these deficit lenses or perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, the long-term consequence is social vulnerability. It's that you become vulnerable to oppression in and out of schools. And so, you know, when schools utilize these deficit perspectives that you're talking about, and let's put some examples on here. So like, when you say deficit perspective, what are you all asking about? Is there something you're thinking of when you say that to me and you ask me that question?
What I was referring to when I thought of that was using terminology that is through deficit lens. For example, at-risk students, disadvantaged students, or the concept of going in and saving students who need saving.
The achievement gap. Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing that tells you is that young people, when I think about like at risk, when folks say at risk, usually they're talking about, example, Black boys, right? They're going to talk, they're thinking those are coded words usually. And so when people are saying that, then that means that it's telling you that Black boys don't belong in the school, that those are not spaces created for them. If they are going to be labeled at risk or constantly at risk, quote unquote, in those spaces, or if the Black-white achievement gap is telling us that Black students are always underperforming and Latinx students are always underperforming, then all that tells us is that they don't belong. And if they don't belong in that institution, you know, the long-term effect is not belonging in U.S. institutions. And so, you know, there's some great research about this, especially I'm thinking about a few things. I'm thinking about a lot of the school to prison pipeline work, et cetera, that kind of tells you some of that long-term effect. But one article in particular, Dr. Kirkland, who's also at NYU, Dr. David E. Kirkland, he talks about the fact that it's not just a school to prison pipeline, it's prison always, it's prison all the time. And so school becomes one piece of the larger puzzle that's informing certain people that they don't belong and that their lives do not matter. And so that's the long-term effect. It's life or death. It's a life or death consequence. And so getting this right is a life or death issue to me.